Wind River Valley, 1835. Jonas Fletcher knelt beside his cabin's south wall, scraping mud from the bottom log. The wood beneath came away soft. Punky, trappers called it. 6 months of ground moisture had done what 2 Wyoming winters could not. The rot had started. Fletcher had built fast the previous autumn, stacking green logs on bare earth the way every trapper in the territory did. Standard method. 3 weeks of work. By spring, decay was eating the sill from underneath. A passing Swedish trapper named Niels Bergstrom walked the perimeter, shook his head, and sketched something in the dirt with a stick. A sacrificial board, a chamfered edge, elevation on stone. Fletcher stared at the drawing. $10 of lumber. 2 days of work. Bergstrom claimed it would add a decade to the cabin's life. They didn't yet know this simple plank would become the standard across the northern Rockies, or that it would save structures from collapse when the hard winters came. November 1834. The first cabin went up in 21 days. Fletcher felled 43 lodgepole pines along the creek, bark still wet with sap. He notched them with a hand axe, stacked them 8 logs high, and packed the gaps with creek clay and dried moss. No foundation. The bottom log sat directly on frozen ground, the way men had built since the first trappers pushed into the Rockies in the 1820s. Speed mattered. Winter was closing in. The beaver streams would freeze, and a man needed shelter before the deep cold arrived. The cabin measured 12 feet by 16 feet inside. Fletcher built the door from split pine planks, hung it on leather hinges, and chinked the walls with whatever came to hand: clay, grass, strips of bark. The fireplace went on the north wall because that side had the flattest ground for a stone base. He cut one small window opening but left it covered with an oiled deerskin. The roof was steep-pitched lodgepole rafters covered with overlapping bark sheets, then a layer of sod cut from the meadow. Total material cost: $4 in nails and hinges hauled from Fort Laramie, 120 miles south. The structure looked sound. Solid logs, tight corners, a roof that shed water. Fletcher moved his traps and supplies inside, built his first fire, and felt satisfied. He had shelter. That was what mattered on the frontier, getting a roof overhead before the snow came. Refinement could wait. Survival came first. December brought the first hard test. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero Fahrenheit. The wind came howling down from the high peaks, and Fletcher discovered what every first-year trapper learned. A cabin built fast was not a cabin built well. Cold air poured through gaps in the chinking. The clay had cracked during the first freeze, and the moss had dried and fallen out in chunks. The fireplace, positioned on the north wall, radiated half its heat straight into the coldest side of the structure. The interior temperature, even with a roaring fire, stayed below freezing most nights. Worse, the green logs began to shrink. Pine loses up to 8% of its diameter as it dries. Gaps opened between the logs, gaps that hadn't existed when Fletcher first stacked them. He spent December re-chinking, stuffing fresh moss and clay into the widening spaces. But the work was futile. The logs kept shrinking. The cold kept seeping in. By January, Fletcher was burning 4 cords of firewood per month, 3 times what he had estimated. His hands were raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. The cabin was shelter, but it was barely livable. February brought a thaw, and Fletcher saw the next problem: water. Snowmelt pooled around the base of the cabin. The bottom logs, sitting directly on the ground, wicked moisture up into the wood. Fletcher didn't think much of it at the time. The logs were frozen solid, but the seeds of decay had been planted. Spring arrived in April. The valley greened up, and Fletcher could finally assess the winter's damage. The chinking had failed almost completely. The leather door hinges had rotted and torn. The deerskin window cover had split. But the most serious problem was invisible, hidden beneath the surface where the bottom logs met the earth. Fletcher pried up a corner of the sod roof and pulled away a section of bark. The bottom log on the south side, where sun had melted the most snow, showed soft spots. He pressed his knife into the wood. It sank in easily. Rot had started. This was the crisis trappers feared. Rot in the sill meant structural failure within a few years. Once decay set into the foundation logs, it spread upward, weakening the entire structure. Replacing a bottom log required jacking up the entire cabin, pulling out the damaged timber, and fitting a new one, work that could take weeks and required help from other men. Most trappers simply abandoned rotting cabins and built new ones, accepting a 3 to 5 year lifespan as normal. Fletcher had invested 21 days in this cabin. He had cut, hauled, and shaped every log himself. The thought of abandoning it and starting over, or facing the massive work of replacing foundation timbers, was intolerable. But he didn't know what else to do. He was a competent carpenter, trained in basic frame construction back in Virginia, but he had never built for these conditions. The moisture, the extreme cold, the rapid temperature swings. These were problems he hadn't anticipated. September 1835. Niels Bergstrom arrived on a cold afternoon when the aspens along the creek were turning gold. Bergstrom was Swedish, 47 years old, and had been trapping the Rockies since 1823. He had seen every mistake a man could make in cabin construction, and he had learned from all of them. He rode up to Fletcher's cabin, dismounted, and walked the perimeter without saying a word. Fletcher watched from the doorway as the older man crouched at each corner, examining the joints, pressing his fingers against the chinking, studying the foundation logs. When Bergstrom finished his inspection, he looked at Fletcher and shook his head. "Your cabin is rotting from the bottom," Bergstrom said. "In 2 years, maybe 3, the south wall will fail." Fletcher had known this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. He explained what he had done: the quick build, the green logs, the problems with shrinkage and moisture. Bergstrom listened, nodded, and then knelt beside the south wall. With a stick, he drew a diagram in the dirt. "In the old country," Bergstrom said, "we learned this 300 years ago. You never put the sill log on bare ground. Never. You elevate the cabin on stone. You put a board under the sill. A sacrificial board, we call it. This board sits between the stone and the log. It takes the moisture. It rots instead of the log. When it rots, you replace the board. 10 minutes of work. No jacking, no log replacement, no collapse." Fletcher studied the sketch. Bergstrom had drawn a simple cross-section. Flat stones for foundation piers, a wide plank laid across the stones, and the bottom log of the cabin resting on that plank. But the plank had a detail that Fletcher didn't immediately understand. The bottom edge was angled, chamfered, creating a slope. "Why the angle?" Fletcher asked. "The drip edge," Bergstrom said. "Water runs down the log, hits the plank, follows the chamfer, and drops away from the foundation. No pooling, no wicking. The plank stays drier, lasts longer. When it does rot, you see it before the log is affected. You replace it. The cabin stands another 10 years. The logic was elegant. Instead of fighting moisture with better chinking or hoping the logs would stay dry, Bergstrom's method accepted that moisture was inevitable. The sacrificial plank was designed to rot, but in a way that protected the structure above it and could be easily replaced. Fletcher asked about materials. Bergstrom explained that any flat plank would work, but hardwood was better than pine. Oak or elm lasted longest, but even pine, if replaced every 5 years, would outlast a cabin built directly on the ground. The plank should be at least 1 inch thick and as wide as the log above it, 12 to 14 inches typically. The chamfer could be cut with a draw knife or a plane, angled at 45 degrees along the bottom outer edge. The stones were equally important. Bergstrom recommended flat limestone or sandstone, not rounded river rocks. Flat stones provided stable bearing surfaces and could be stacked to create level piers. The cabin should sit at least 6 inches off the ground, preferably 12. This elevation prevented splashback from rain, discouraged insects, and created an air gap that kept the bottom logs drier. Fletcher asked about the cost. Bergstrom estimated $10 for lumber if Fletcher bought it from a sawmill, or nothing if Fletcher split his own planks from logs. Stone was free, gathered from the creek bed. The additional labor, 2 days to set piers and cut planks, plus the time to rebuild the cabin with the new foundation. If Fletcher was starting from scratch, the extra work was minimal. If he was saving an existing cabin, the decision was harder. They discussed Fletcher's current situation. The rot in the south sill was advanced, but not catastrophic. If Fletcher acted now, before the next winter, he could jack up that wall, remove the damaged log, install stone piers and a sacrificial plank, and set a new sill log. The other 3 walls would follow over the next year. It was manageable work for one man, spread across seasons. Bergstrom stayed one night, shared his fire and his knowledge, and rode out the next morning. Fletcher watched him disappear into the timber and then turned back to his cabin. For the first time since discovering the rot, he felt he had a solution, not just a patch, but a genuine fix that would extend the structure's life far beyond the normal 3 to 5 year span. October 1835. Fletcher began gathering stones. He worked the creek bed for a week, selecting flat pieces of limestone and sandstone, each one roughly the size of a dinner plate or larger. He hauled them back to the cabin in a canvas sling, stacking them near the south wall. By the end of the week, he had 200 pounds of stone, enough for 8 piers to support the south and east walls where the rot was worst. The work was methodical. Fletcher started with the south wall because that side showed the most decay. He built 4 temporary supports from lodgepole pine, positioning them under the roof eaves to carry the structure's weight. Then he used a pry bar and a fulcrum log to lift the south wall 1/2 inch at a time, inserting wooden shims to hold it. The process took an entire afternoon. When the wall was finally elevated 6 inches, Fletcher could see the full extent of the damage. The bottom log on the south side was rotted through in 2 places. The wood was soft, dark, and spongy, completely compromised. Fletcher removed it entirely, sliding it out from between the second log and the ground. With the damaged timber out, he could now install the new foundation system. He began by leveling the ground beneath each pier location. This was critical. If the stones sat on uneven earth, they would shift over time, causing the cabin to settle unevenly and creating new stress points. Fletcher used a hand level, a simple tool consisting of a wooden stick with a vial of water and a bubble to ensure each spot was flat. Next came the stone piers. Fletcher stacked flat stones in columns, each pier rising 12 inches above grade. He used smaller stones as shims to ensure each column was perfectly level and plumb. No mortar, just careful stone selection and tight fitting. The dry stacked piers would allow for minor adjustments if the ground settled, and they were far easier to repair than mortared foundations. With the piers in place, Fletcher turned to the sacrificial planks. He had purchased 2 12-foot lengths of 2-inch thick pine plank from a sawmill in South Pass City, 140 miles west. The lumber cost $8, expensive, but Fletcher could not afford to split his own planks to the precision required. He needed straight, flat boards with consistent thickness. Fletcher used a draw knife to cut the drip chamfer along the bottom outer edge of each plank. The chamfer ran the full length of the board, angled at 45 degrees, creating a sharp edge that would shed water. The work took 2 hours per plank. When finished, the boards looked almost decorative, far more refined than any other component of the cabin. He laid the first plank across the 4 south wall piers, adjusted it until it was level and square to the cabin line, and then set the new sill log on top of it. The sill was a fresh-cut lodgepole pine, debarked and allowed to dry for 6 weeks. Fletcher had hewed flat surfaces on the top and bottom to ensure tight contact with the plank below and the second log above. When he lowered the cabin back down onto the new sill, the fit was snug. The temporary supports came out. The wall held. Fletcher stepped back and examined his work. The cabin now sat 12 inches off the ground on the south side, high enough that rain splash would not reach the sill and air could circulate beneath. The sacrificial plank was clearly visible, a pale band of fresh pine between the dark stones and the weathered log above it. The drip chamfer, though small, was obvious once you knew to look for it, a sharp edge that broke the path of water running down the sill face. November brought early snow. Fletcher spent the next weeks extending the foundation system to the other 3 walls, working between storms. By December, the entire cabin sat on stone piers with sacrificial planks under every sill log. The transformation was subtle but complete. The structure no longer touched the earth. Moisture from snowmelt and rain had nowhere to wick into the logs. The cabin had been given a new foundation and a new lease on life. January 1836. The first hard cold arrived on the 6th of the month. Temperatures dropped to 30 below 0 Fahrenheit and stayed there for 11 days. The wind came down from the peaks in sustained blasts that shook the cabin walls and piled snow in drifts against the north side. Inside, Fletcher kept the fire burning and recorded temperatures. He had installed a simple mercury thermometer purchased from Fort Laramie on the interior wall opposite the fireplace. Each morning at dawn and each evening at dusk, he noted the reading. The data revealed what Fletcher had suspected. The elevated foundation made a measurable difference. The previous winter, with the cabin sitting on bare ground, interior temperatures had rarely risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even with a roaring fire. Cold radiated up from the frozen earth through the sill logs and into the living space. Fletcher had burned 4 cords of firewood per month, fighting this thermal drain. This winter, with the cabin elevated and isolated from the ground by stone and plank, the interior stayed warmer with less fuel. Fletcher burned 2.5 cords per month, a reduction of 38%. The temperature inside the cabin hovered between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, dropping to 40 overnight when the fire burned down to coals. The difference was not dramatic, but it was persistent. Fletcher no longer woke to frost on the inside walls. His water bucket, placed near the fireplace, stayed liquid through the night. His hands, less raw from constant wood splitting, could manage fine work, repairing traps, sewing leather, maintaining gear. The cabin had crossed a threshold from barely survivable to genuinely habitable. Fletcher also noticed improvements in the chinking. With the cabin elevated, rain and snowmelt no longer pooled around the base of the walls, reducing the moisture that had caused the clay chinking to crack and fail. The gaps between logs remained sealed through the winter. Fletcher still had to re-chink in spots, but the work was minimal compared to the constant maintenance of the previous year. By February, Fletcher had calculated the fuel savings with trapper's math. 38% less firewood meant 15 fewer days per winter spent cutting, splitting, and hauling wood. That was 2 full weeks he could spend running his trap lines, hunting, or simply resting. The value of that time, measured in additional pelts or preserved energy, far exceeded the $8 he had spent on planks and the 2 days of labor installing the foundation system. The mercury thermometer also revealed something unexpected. On clear, sunny days, even in deep winter, the cabin warmed significantly. The south-facing wall, now elevated off the frozen ground, absorbed solar radiation and held it. The thermal mass of the logs, no longer drained by direct contact with frozen earth, retained heat through the afternoon and into the evening. Fletcher had not designed for this passive solar effect, but the elevated foundation enabled it. Fletcher recorded these observations in a small, leather-bound journal, noting dates, temperatures, fuel consumption, and weather conditions. The entries were terse, factual. January 14, 1836. Morning temp, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Evening, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear sky, wind from NW. Burned 1-2 cord this week, chinking holes. The journal was not intended for publication or even for sharing. It was simply Fletcher's way of understanding what worked and what did not. But those notes would later become a record of the first documented case of a skirt-first sill installation in the Wind River Valley, and proof that the method delivered measurable results. June 1836. The valley turned green, and temperatures climbed into the 80s Fahrenheit during the day. Most frontier cabins became unbearable in summer, thick log walls that trapped heat, low roofs that radiated warmth downward, and no effective ventilation. Trappers spent summer nights sleeping outside rather than enduring the sweatbox interiors. Fletcher expected his cabin to follow the same pattern, but the elevated foundation delivered an unexpected benefit. The crawl space beneath the floor created a convection current. Cool air, drawn from the shaded north side, flowed under the cabin and rose through gaps in the floorboards, creating a gentle upward draft. The effect was subtle but noticeable. The cabin interior stayed 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the outside air during the hottest part of the day. Fletcher enhanced this natural ventilation by opening the small window on the south wall during mornings and evenings, when outside air was coolest. He closed it during midday when the sun was strongest. This simple routine, combined with the thermal buffer provided by the elevated floor, kept the cabin comfortable through the summer. He also observed that the sacrificial planks stayed dry during summer rains. Water running off the roof hit the ground and splashed, but the chamfered drip edges directed moisture away from the foundation. The planks, checked monthly, showed no signs of rot. Fletcher noted this in his journal. July 3, 1836. Planks dry, no decay. Elevation works as claimed. Other trappers passing through the valley stopped at Fletcher's cabin and asked about the elevated foundation. Why the extra work? What advantage did it provide? Fletcher explained the rot prevention, the fuel savings, the improved summer ventilation. Some nodded and moved on, uninterested in changing methods that had served them adequately. Others asked more questions. Where did you get the planks? How do you cut the chamfer? How level do the stones need to be? Fletcher shared the technique freely. There was no reason to hoard knowledge that could help others survive the mountains. He sketched the cross-section in dirt, just as Bergstrom had done for him. He explained the logic. Isolate the structure from ground moisture, create a replaceable sacrificial layer, direct water away with the drip edge. Some trappers adopted the method immediately. Others filed it away, planning to use it when they built their next cabin. By late summer, 2 more cabins in the valley had been built on elevated stone foundations with sacrificial planks. Fletcher had not promoted the method or claimed any credit. He had simply used it, demonstrated that it worked, and answered questions when asked. The technique spread because it solved a real problem, rot in foundation logs, that every trapper faced. October 1836. Fletcher stacked firewood for the coming winter. He had spent September cutting, splitting, and hauling wood, working the Yodin same creekside timber he had used the previous year. But this year his target was different. Based on the previous winter's fuel consumption, he estimated needing 15 cords to get through to April, 40% less than the 24 cords he had burned the first winter. A cord of firewood measures 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of stacked wood. Each cord represents roughly 3 days of hard labor, 1 day to fell and buck the trees, 1 day to split the rounds, and 1 day to haul and stack the wood. 24 cords meant 72 days of work. 15 cords meant 45 days, a savings of 27 days, nearly a month of labor. Fletcher finished stacking his 15th cord on October 28th. The woodpile stood against the cabin's north wall, protected from prevailing winds and covered with bark sheets to shed rain. He had a full month before the deep cold would arrive, and his fuel supply was complete. The previous year, he had still been cutting wood in early December, racing against the weather, exhausting himself before the hardest months even began. The difference was entirely due to the elevated foundation and the thermal efficiency it provided. Fletcher's cabin was not warmer because he had upgraded the walls or improved the fireplace. It was warmer because cold no longer drained into the structure from below. The ground coupling effect, the continuous thermal bridge between frozen earth and living space, had been eliminated. The cabin sat on stone and wood, materials that conducted heat far more slowly than direct earth contact. Fletcher calculated the economic value of his fuel savings. At $3 per cord for purchased wood, or 3 days of labor for self-cut wood, 15 cords represented $45 or 45 days. The $8 he had spent on sacrificial planks had paid for itself in fuel savings in less than one winter. Every subsequent winter would show pure profit. Fewer days cutting wood, less physical strain, more time for productive work. This was frontier economics at its most direct. Time was the limiting resource. A man alone in the mountains had only so many hours of daylight, so many days of physical strength. Any technique that reduced necessary labor without compromising survival was worth adopting. The skirt first sill for $8 and 2 days of work bought back a month of time every year. January 1837. The thermometer outside Fletcher's cabin read 42 below zero Fahrenheit on the morning of January 9th. Inside, the mercury stood at 46 degrees. Fletcher added wood to the fire, wrapped himself in a wool blanket, and waited for the cold snap to break. The extreme cold lasted 9 days. Temperatures never rose above zero. The wind was merciless, driving through the valley at 30 miles per hour, creating wind chills that would kill an exposed man in minutes. Fletcher stayed inside, venturing out only to retrieve firewood from the stack against the north wall. Even that brief exposure, 30 seconds in the open, left his face numb and his lungs burning. Inside the cabin, the elevated foundation continued to perform. The crawl space beneath the floor, filled with still air, acted as an insulating layer. Cold could not conduct upward from the frozen ground because there was no continuous path. The stone piers, though frozen, transferred far less cold than earth contact would have. The sacrificial planks, now well seasoned and dry, provided an additional thermal break. Fletcher burned 3 cords of firewood during those 9 days, heavy consumption, but manageable. He did not run out. He did not panic. He simply maintained the fire, kept the interior temperature above 40 degrees, and waited for the weather to change. On January 18th, the cold broke. Temperatures climbed to 10 above zero, warm by comparison. Fletcher went outside to inspect the cabin for damage. The logs showed no cracks. The roof had held under heavy snow load. The chinking remained intact, and most importantly, the sacrificial planks under the sill logs showed no signs of stress or failure. They had endured the extreme cold without cracking or splitting. Fletcher recorded the event in his journal. January 9th of 1837. Coldest span on record. Cabin held. Fuel sufficient. Foundation sound. Method proven. The entry was matter of fact, but it marked a turning point. Fletcher had survived an extreme weather event, the kind of cold that killed men and destroyed poorly built structures, with margin to spare. His cabin had not just endured, it had remained comfortable. And the foundation system, the simple innovation of stone piers and sacrificial planks, had been a critical factor in that survival. Word of Fletcher's success spread through the trapping community. Men who had dismissed the elevated foundation as unnecessary work began reconsidering. If the method could handle 42 below, it could handle anything the Rockies could deliver. April 1838. Fletcher knelt beside his cabin's south wall and examined the sacrificial plank. After 2.5 years of exposure to weather, the pine board showed its first signs of serious decay. The outer surface had grayed and roughened. Small cracks ran along the grain. When Fletcher pressed his knife into the wood near the drip edge, it sank 1/2 inch, soft but not yet punky. The plank had done its job. It had taken the moisture, the freeze-thaw cycles, the UV exposure. The sill log above it, protected by the plank's sacrificial roll, remained sound. Fletcher ran his hand along the bottom of the sill. The wood was dry, hard, and intact, exactly as it should be. Replacing the plank took one morning. Fletcher jacked up the south wall, removed the old plank, and slid a new one into place. The new board was oak this time, purchased from a traveling merchant. For $12, expensive, but oak would last twice as long as pine. Fletcher cut the drip chamfer with his draw knife, positioned the plank on the stone piers, and lowered the cabin back down. The entire operation took 4 hours. This was the moment the design was truly validated. Fletcher had not prevented rot. He had simply relocated it to a component that could be easily replaced. The sill log, which would have required jacking the entire cabin and days of heavy labor to replace, was untouched. The plank, which required only a few hours of work, had rotted instead. The economics were stark. Replacing a sill log, 5 to 7 days of work, help from another man required, risk of structural damage during the process. Replacing a sacrificial plank, 4 hours of work, 1 man, no risk. The difference between catastrophic failure and routine maintenance. Fletcher saved the old plank, cutting it into short sections for firewood. The wood was still useful, even in its decayed state. Nothing was wasted on the frontier, but the real value of that rotted plank was not as fuel, it was as proof. Proof that the method worked. Proof that a $10 board could save a cabin. Proof that Niels Bergstrom's advice, sketched in the dirt 3 years earlier, had been sound. By 1838, at least 7 cabins in the Wind River Valley had been built or retrofitted with the skirt-first sill method. The technique had a name now, coined by a trapper named William Crawford, the Fletcher Foundation. Fletcher himself never used the term, but it stuck. 1840. The account books at Fort Supply, a trading post on the Green River in southwestern Wyoming Territory, recorded an unusual spike in lumber sales. Between April and September, the fort sold 174 linear feet of 2-inch plank, triple the previous year's volume. The ledger noted the buyers, trappers, homesteaders, and a few Shoshone families building semi-permanent structures near the fort. The reason for the spike was clear to anyone who asked. The skirt-first sill had become standard practice in the region. Men building new cabins elevated them on stone foundations with sacrificial planks as a matter of course. Men with existing cabins retrofitted them, jacking up walls and installing the planks beneath sill logs. The method had spread not through formal promotion, but through observed results. A cabin built on a Fletcher foundation lasted measurably longer than one built on bare ground. Trappers compared notes at rendezvous gatherings, and the data was consistent. Elevated cabins required less firewood, stayed drier in spring, and avoided the catastrophic sill rot that forced rebuilding every 3 to 5 years. The additional cost, $10 to $15 in lumber and stone, plus 2 days of labor, was trivial compared to the benefit. Indigenous builders in the region also adopted elements of the technique. Shoshone families constructing log structures near Fort Supply began elevating them on stone piers, though they rarely used the sacrificial plank. Instead, they relied on periodic inspection and replacement of the sill logs themselves, accepting a 5 to 7 year replacement cycle. The elevation alone provided significant protection against moisture and insect damage. The fort's clerk, a man named Samuel Morris, noted the trend in a margin entry dated July 8, 1840. plank sails extraordinary. Every man building now raises his cabin. Fletcher's method is the rule. Fletcher himself had moved south by this time, relocating to the Oregon Territory in 1839. He left his original cabin standing in the Wind River Valley. It would remain occupied by various trappers and homesteaders until 1856, a 17-year lifespan, more than 3 times the typical frontier cabin. When it was finally abandoned, the structure was still sound. The sill logs showed no rot. The third set of sacrificial planks, replaced in 1854, were still in place and functional. The diffusion of the skirt-first sill demonstrated how frontier innovation spread, not through patents or formal instruction, but through demonstration, observation, and shared necessity. A technique that worked, that solved a real problem without requiring exotic materials or specialized skills, would propagate naturally through a community facing that problem. 1856. A carpenter's manual published in St. Louis included a section on frontier log construction. Titled Practical Methods for Western Settlers, the manual devoted 3 pages to foundation techniques for log structures. One diagram showed a cross-section labeled Elevated Sill with Sacrificial Baseboard, Wyoming Method. The illustration was precise: stone piers, a wide plank with a chamfered lower edge, and a hewn sill log resting on the plank. The accompanying text explained the purpose. This arrangement prevents decay by interposing a replaceable timber between the foundation and the load-bearing sill. The chamfered edge directs water away from the pier, extending the life of all components, common in territories of Wyoming, Montana, and northern Utah. The manual did not mention Jonas Fletcher by name. By 1856, the origin of the technique had been obscured by 17 years of transmission and adaptation. Builders used it because it worked, not because they knew who had first implemented it in the Wind River Valley. The method had become anonymous, absorbed into the general body of frontier building practice. But the inclusion in a printed manual marked a transition. What had begun as one trapper's response to rotting sill logs had become formalized knowledge, codified and distributed to thousands of westward migrants. Homesteaders planning to build in unfamiliar territory could now reference an authoritative source that recommended the skirt-first sill as standard practice. Other publications followed. An 1862 U.S. Army manual on frontier fortifications included similar recommendations for elevated foundations. An 1868 Agricultural Extension Bulletin from the Montana Territory advised homesteaders to raise all structures on stone, with planks placed under sills to accept moisture and prevent rot. By the 1870s, the technique appeared in multiple regional building guides, each presenting it as established practice. The formalization had consequences. As railroads pushed west and sawmills became more common, the materials needed for skirt-first sills became cheaper and more accessible. Planks that cost $10 in 1835 cost $3 in 1865, once rail transport reduced freight costs. The technique, once limited to those willing to invest significant resources, became economically feasible for even the poorest homesteader. Architects designing planned communities in the territories incorporated elevated foundations into their specifications. Towns laid out in the 1870s and 80s often required stone or masonry piers for all wooden structures, with building codes enforcing the standard. The method had traveled from individual innovation to regional practice to codified requirement. A journey of 40 years. 1952. Workers demolishing an abandoned cabin near Pinedale, Wyoming, discovered that the structure's sill logs were in remarkable condition. The cabin had stood for over 70 years, built in 1881 by a homesteader named Thomas Grant. Beneath each sill log was a thick oak plank resting on limestone piers. The planks, replaced twice according to carved dates on their undersides, 1896 and 1914, had done their job. The sill logs showed no rot. The demolition crew, recognizing the historical significance, contacted the Wyoming Heritage Museum. Curators examined the structure and documented the foundation system. Photographs showed the chamfered drip edges on the planks, the carefully stacked stone piers, and the pristine condition of 71-year-old Sill logs. One Sill log was removed intact and transported to the museum, where it remains on display. The museum label reads, "Log Cabin Sill, circa 1881, Pinedale vicinity. Note the absence of decay despite 7 decades of exposure. This timber was protected by a sacrificial plank foundation system, a technique developed in the 1830s that extended cabin lifespans significantly. The method became standard practice throughout the Rocky Mountain region by the 1850s. The preserved Sill log is dense, straight-grained pine, hand-hewn flat on top and bottom. The wood is dark with age, but shows no soft spots, no insect damage, no water staining. Core samples taken in 1983 confirmed that the interior wood retained structural integrity equivalent to fresh-cut timber. The log had been functionally preserved for over a century by the simple expedient of keeping it isolated from ground moisture. This physical evidence closes the loop on the skirt-first Sill story. Fletcher's 1835 innovation, implemented in response to rotting foundation logs, demonstrably worked. Cabins built with the technique lasted 3 to 5 times longer than those built on bare ground. The method spread because it delivered measurable, repeatable results, and because the materials and skills required were accessible to any competent builder. The technique's success was not dramatic. No lives were saved by elevated foundations in the way lives were saved by better fireplaces or thicker walls. But structural longevity mattered on the frontier. Every year a cabin remained habitable was a year a family did not have to rebuild. Every decade of service was time and labor that could be invested elsewhere, in farms, businesses, communities. The quiet persistence of well-built structures shaped settlement patterns across the West. 1881. Jonas Fletcher died in Oregon Territory at age 72. Among his possessions was a small leather-bound journal covering the years 1835 through 1838. His daughter, sorting through his belongings, found the journal and read the terse entries documenting cabin construction, fuel consumption, and foundation maintenance. She did not recognize the significance of what she was reading. To her, it was simply her father's notes from his trapping years, weather records, supply lists, technical observations. She stored the journal with other family papers, where it remained for decades. In 1927, a historian researching frontier building practices contacted Fletcher's descendants, asking if any documents from Jonas's time in Wyoming had survived. The journal was retrieved from storage and examined. The entries, particularly those from 1835 and 1836, provided the first documentary evidence of the skirt-first Sill's development. Fletcher's handwriting was clear and factual. September 12, 1835, Swedish trapper advised elevating cabin on stone, claims sacrificial plank under sill will prevent rot. Cost $8 lumber, 2 days work, will attempt. October 31, 1835, south wall rebuilt. Foundation now, 12 inches elevation on limestone piers, pine plank with chamfer installed, sill log dry. January 20th, 1836, winter fuel consumption, 2.5 cords, chalk month versus 4 cords previous winter. Interior temp, 48.54 degrees Fahrenheit versus 38.42 degrees Fahrenheit last year. Foundation eliminates ground coupling cold loss. April 8, 1838, replace south plank. Oak this time. Sill log above remains sound, no rot. Design validated. The journal entries provided dates, costs, and measurable outcomes. They confirmed that the technique had originated as a response to a specific problem, sill rot, that it had been shared freely, Bergstrom to Fletcher, Fletcher to others, and that it had delivered quantifiable benefits. Reduced fuel use extended structural life. Historians traced the technique's diffusion using Fletcher's journal as a starting point. They found references in other trappers' diaries, in fort supply ledgers, in territorial building codes, and eventually in national architectural manuals. The trail of evidence showed a clear progression: individual innovation, local adoption, regional standardization, national codification. Fletcher had not sought recognition. He had simply recorded what worked, but those records, preserved by chance and examined decades later, revealed how practical knowledge spread on the frontier, not through proclamation or patent, but through observation, adaptation, and quiet sharing among people facing common challenges. 2024, a fragment of oak plank approximately 8 inches long sits in a climate-controlled drawer at the Wyoming State Archives in Cheyenne. The plank is dark with age, the grain raised and weathered, but the chamfered edge along one side remains clearly visible, a 45-degree bevel cut by hand that once directed water away from a cabin foundation. The fragment was recovered during a 2015 archaeological survey of an abandoned homestead near South Pass. Dendrochronology dated the oak to 1863. The chamfer showed tool marks consistent with a draw knife or spoke shave, hand tools common in the mid-19th century. The plank had served under a cabin sill for approximately 40 years before the structure burned in 1903. The foundation survived the fire, and the plank remained in place until the archaeological team excavated the site. This small piece of wood represents the distillation of Fletcher's innovation, a simple angled cut that changed how water interacted with the structure. The chamfer was not decorative, it was purely functional, a geometry that exploited gravity to protect the materials above it. The 45-degree angle was optimal, steep enough to shed water quickly, shallow enough to be cut easily with basic tools. The plank fragment also represents the persistence of good design. 160 years after Fletcher installed the first sacrificial planks in the Wind River Valley, the technique remained embedded in construction practice. Modern building codes for wooden structures require moisture barriers, flashing, and drainage details that serve the same purpose Fletcher's chamfered plank served, keeping water away from vulnerable materials. The specific implementation has changed. Modern builders use pressure-treated lumber, metal flashing, and synthetic membranes instead of sacrificial planks. But the principle, interpose a replaceable barrier between foundation and structure, remains fundamental. Fletcher did not invent moisture management. He simply applied it in a context where it was desperately needed, using materials and methods available to a lone trapper in the wilderness. That oak fragment, preserved in an archival drawer, is tagged with a simple label: Foundation Plank C. 1863. Note: chamfered drip edge. Standard detail in frontier log construction, 1840s, 1890s. The note does not mention Fletcher. It does not trace the lineage back to that autumn afternoon in 1835 when Niels Bergstrom sketched a diagram in the dirt. But the chamfer on that fragment of wood carries forward a solution that saved structures and simplified lives across 50 years of Western settlement. Wind River Valley, 2024. The location where Jonas Fletcher's first cabin stood is now marked by a small interpretive sign along County Road 14. The sign, installed by the Wyoming State Historical Society in 2018, includes a diagram of the skirt first sill and a brief explanation. Site of Jonas Fletcher's cabin, 1834-1839. Fletcher pioneered the use of elevated stone foundations with sacrificial planks for log structures, a technique that extended building lifespans significantly and became standard practice throughout the Rocky Mountain region by the 1850s. No trace of the cabin remains. The logs rotted away decades ago. The stone piers were scattered by frost heave, and even the sacrificial planks have long since returned to the soil. But the technique Fletcher implemented here, learned from a passing trapper and refined through 2 harsh winters, spread across half a continent and persisted for over a century. The innovation was not glamorous. It required no invention, no rare materials, no exceptional skill. It was simply the correct application of basic principles, elevation, drainage, sacrificial protection, to a problem that killed cabins and cost settlers years of labor. Fletcher saw the problem, learned a solution, tested it, and shared it. That sequence, repeated across thousands of challenges and solutions, built the infrastructure of Western settlement. The sacrificial plank, that $10 board with a chamfered edge, represents frontier pragmatism at its finest. Minimal investment, maximum return, and a willingness to accept that some things are designed to fail so that others can endure. Fletcher's Sill logs, protected by planks that rotted in their place, lasted decades instead of years. The technique, documented in journals, ledgers, and manuals, outlasted the man who implemented it. Standing at the site today, looking across the valley where Fletcher cut his logs and stacked his stones, the question is not why the technique succeeded. The question is why it was not standard practice from the beginning. The answer: knowledge travels slowly, even when lives and labor depend on it. Fletcher built fast the first time, using accepted methods, and nearly lost his cabin to rot. He built correctly the second time, using borrowed wisdom, and created a structure that stood for 17 years. The difference was 2 days of work and $8 of lumber. That difference, multiplied across the frontier, measured in decades of habitation and months of saved labor, is Fletcher's legacy. Not a name on a plaque, but a method that worked. What choice would you have made in 1835? Build fast and risk rot, or invest 2 extra days for a structure that would outlast you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Practical stories keep this history alive.